Boy, I was enjoying the service so much, I was about to sit down and say, boy, I hope someone has a good sermon coming up. I was like, oh, wait, that's me. You know, you take a week off, you spend a little time someplace else, and that rhythm just goes out the window. You know, when I first started here back in 2020, I was so disappointed because, you know, what happened March 2020, a couple weeks later, everything sort of went out the window. And one of the things that sort of fell through kind of the cracks and didn't reemerge was one of the celebration events that we had for our, is it 150 or 200 years? 150 in 2019? It was 150, right? 150th. And there was a concert that had been planned here by Carrie Newcomer, the Indiana singer-songwriter. She's from down in Bloomington. Amazing. So I'm disappointed that didn't sort of, we kept trying to reschedule it, and then they kept saying, no, this pandemic thing's going to go longer. And we talked to their people, and their people talked to our people. So hopefully that one of those things we'll find a way to kind of make up for that. I love Carrie Newcomer. And there's a song that she sings that in particular has always meant a lot to me. And it came to mind as we were thinking about this series that we're doing for our season of stewardship and generosity around, everyone being welcome at the table. Come to the table. And, the table where, we have a different table today. Maybe we'll have a different table next Sunday. Who knows? Tables come in all shapes and sizes. And there's this line that I love, but you got to set it up by, kind of hearing the verse first. She writes these words about a little place called Betty's Diner. Miranda works the late night counter, a little joint called Betty's Diner. Chrome and checkered tablecloths, one steamy window pane. She got the job that shaky fall, and after hours she'll write till dawn, and with a nod she serves them all. But it's the chorus. Here we are all in one place, the wants and the wounds of the human race. Despair and hope sit face to face when you come in from the cold. Let her fill your cup with something kind, eggs and toast like bread and wine. She's heard it all, so she don't mind. Eggs and toast like bread and wine. And I think that is one of the most holy lyrics I can think of in the pantheon of words that have been written, because it is a reminder that communion tables are in so many more places than in church sanctuaries. Communion tables are everywhere. Where there is love and there is a table, there is the possibility for communion. I think there's no higher honor that can be bestowed upon any horizontal surface, any flat area, because any of them can be a communion table when there is something that is shared from it. It's the reason that communion is one of the only two sacraments that we have here in the United Methodist Church, communion and baptism. Those are the only two things that we call sacraments. Other traditions have more, but here in the Methodist Church, there's only two things that we name as sacramental. Sacrament. An inward sign, an outward sign of an inward grace. It is what God does that we cannot comprehend, and yet we experience that mystery in some way. It's something that we can point to, something that we can do that's tangible, that makes something somehow recognizable, even if we cannot fully explain or name it. Sacrament takes something that's simple, something that's ordinary, something that you can touch and feel like bread and wine or eggs and coffee, a tortilla filled with meat and a Coca-Cola. Anything that is shared can be turned into a transcendent experience that has no cultural boundaries, that is somehow universal. Today's Royal Communion Sunday. I had to pick one of my several stools from Guatemala, but this one happens to feel very fall-like, and it didn't clash with my shirt. I like this one because it actually has all the liturgical colors in, so it kind of can work at any time. But you see behind me also that reminder of the cultures of the world, the cloths from Africa, Guatemala, this one's from Peru, I'm sure, and the breads of all different shapes and sizes from different cultures and traditions. Today we Methodists join folks from all around the globe, all denominations, believers worldwide, to share in that communion where we recognize our unity in Christ. And I was thinking about that this week, and it occurred to me that this podcast that we listen to kind of got at these things that we're invited to think about with both this Romans and this Matthew text today. I like to listen to podcasts. I don't have enough time to listen to all the ones that I want, so they sort of stack up. And the one that I try to listen to is the one on the news that, like, if I don't get to listen to the full 2 hours of whatever that news broadcast is and all the fluffy stuff and all the news stuff, this one gets, the essentials you need to know for the day. But then sometimes something else will pop up in my podcast thread afterwards, and I find the time, stop what I'm doing, whatever, to finish it. And this one popped into my next up thread. And it's Jonathan Capehart, who's a columnist with the Washington Post, and he has a podcast called Cape Up. And he was talking with the journalist Michelle Norris. Now, if you're an NPR aficionado, you might remember that Michelle Norris was one of the All Things Considered evening hosts from, I think, 2002 to 2011. So it was a while back, but you would recognize her voice. And she tells how, and Jonathan Capehart was interviewing her because she herself has a new podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. And she now is also a columnist and an opinion writer, I think, for the Washington Post as well. So, synergy there, right? And she tells how she kind of stumbled onto the idea for doing this podcast called Your Mama's Kitchen. And, when she started talking about it, it really resonated with me. And then she started telling stories. But this is how she kind of stumbled onto this idea about what does this conversation about Your Mama's Kitchen look like. She said, I was a radio host for years on NPR, and she says, I have a low voice. And so we would have to do a mic check to make sure that the sound volume and produced was similar to the person that was being interviewed. And so you'd have to have a little conversation so that could be worked out with the tech team, right? Tech team, because those things need to be worked out, right? Yeah, they're waving yes. You can't just walk in cold, as I sometimes do, and at least they know what my voice sounds like. And so the standard question, she said, was, what did you have for breakfast? And that should get them talking. But the problem was that, and she demonstrated this with the person that she was speaking with. She says, what did you have for breakfast? And the person said, coffee. And the problem was that question didn't really elicit much vocal demonstration, right? Coffee, cereal, toast. It wasn't enough to really kind of get the words flowing. So she thought of some other questions. Paper or plastic at the grocery store? Tell me about your first summer job. Until she stumbled on this question. Tell me about your mama's kitchen. Tell me about your mama's kitchen. What does your mama's kitchen look like, Jana? Roberta? Jenny? Todd, what is your mama's kitchen? Or is there a kitchen in your life that you recall? The sights, the smells, the sound. That always got people talking. And she said it took people into interesting places. It opened them up. And she thought, this would be a great podcast. And so years later, that's exactly what she did, because that's what kitchens do. They open us up. They can be of any shape and size. They can be small. They can be large. But she says we pack a lot of things into that one room in the house. Think about your own kitchen, right? When you have a party, where's everybody? You can put all the stuff out on the deck and in that beautiful gathering space that you paid so much money for when you bought your house. And where does everybody wind up? In the kitchen. I think that's why so many homes today that are sort of mindful of this have these open plans where actually those spaces kind of all flow together, because you're not going to get away from that bar, that stove, that counter space. The kitchen is the place where we all wind up. It's where you hear the laughter loudest. It's where you have your emotional moments. It's where you argue with your parents, spar with your siblings, dance with your friends. And I think in so many places the kitchen table is so important. It might not actually be a kitchen table. It might maybe be that bar with bar stools around it. But it is that surface where things happen, where things gather. It's where the clutter accumulates. The mail, the craft project, the bill paying, the study books. Our kitchens are so important because, not just because they are meals, but because all of the traditions of our lives are wrapped up there. Michelle talked about the ways that those things that are important in our lives are evidenced by everything that happens in the kitchen. She says, maybe you moved from the south to the north. And so those dinners that you serve up reflect those cultural roots. Maybe you came to the United States from someplace far away. You serve a little bit of home up there in the kitchen, at that kitchen table. It's the heartbeat of the home. It's where we absorb everything about who we are and where we take that out into the world. I think about a couple conversations that she shared. One of them was about the chef, Jose Andres, the Spanish-born chef who's now a humanitarian who's been nominated for even on the short list for the Peace Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. And the other one I think about is Harry Kondabolu. Anybody know who Harry Kondabolu is? A comedian, actor. He had a show on CNN with Camus Bell. Talks often about sort of race and culture and those things, but he's a comedian. He actually has, I think, a master's degree from Harvard in like world economics or something like that, and somehow found his way into comedy. I don't get people like that. But Harry talks about how he sort of discovered and learned about his mom by watching her in the kitchen and the things that were important to her and the things that, as a result, became important to him. And one of the things that he had to put together as he had more maturity and as he had sort of seen these things emerge in his life was how his mom sort of used that space to define the things that were important, not by anything that she said, but by what she did. You see, both his parents emigrated from India at different times. And so first his father, then his mother came. Harry was born here in the U.S., but his parents had not been here in the U.S. very long. And they had both left medical careers in India to start over again in the U.S. And one of the things that he saw from his mother was that, first of all, she used the kitchen to sort of explore her new American immersion, right? She learned how to cook different things and that were American and so on, but she also kept a little bit of home. But she also recognized that those things that were important from her culture, from her tradition, which was an honoring of the lives of the elders, family members, they were not there any longer. His grandparents were back in India. And so she would invite people into the kitchen to entertain him at the kitchen table. She would invite them to kind of hang out with him, and he thought it was only because she needed childcare so that she could do what she needed to do. I'm presuming that she maybe needed to study for boards or things like that to transfer all that education into a usefulness in the American system. I think later on both his mother and father worked in science and academia. But in those interim years, in those early years, she would bring in these elders from throughout the building that they lived in. And he thought it was just to take care of him, but he realized that she wanted people, elders, people with wisdom in their lives, to transmit them to him, that they had something to teach. She wanted him to learn respect for this older generation. And so she figured all of this out around the kitchen table. And then there's Jose Andres, the Spanish-born chef who formed World Central Kitchen. You've probably heard of him. He's gotten a lot of press. He's organized meals in disaster zones. He's shown up in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Zambia, Peru, Cuba, Uganda, Cambodia, Poland, and now he's working with teams that go to the edge, to the borders of Ukraine in that terrible conflict zone. Chef Jose Andres talked with Michelle Norris about his mother's kitchen. And what he remembers and what he told her was not the meals when they had plenty, not the meals at the beginning of the month when money was more plentiful, when the cupboards were full. What he remembers was the end of the month. I love this, the end of the month. Because he saw later how his mom had to improvise at the end of the month, how she had to look in her cupboard and say, okay, I have this now, and this is all we've got, and how do I take it and turn it into something creative and delicious and wonderful? And through that, he learned this creativity, this imaginative way of seeing the world, not just the kitchen, but the world. And so when he has to jet into these zones, he has to look around, no matter what that disaster might be, and say, what do I have? What do I know? And how can I turn this into something that is creative, something that is delicious, and something that will, these are his words, nourish people's souls. I love this. This is love. This is the table of love. This is what we do. And it asks us, how do we do this in our community? How do we look around, not just with food, but what is here? And turn that into something that nourishes people's souls. This is what the table does. This is what the communion table asks of us, is to think with that kind of creativity about the love that Christ puts in each one of us, love that is transcendent, love that crosses all borders, love that is universal. The center of our Matthew reading, we are invited to think about what it is like to live together, even in the midst of conflict. And our commentary really kind of leaned into sort of that person-to-person conflict, right? It's a very well-known passage. You know, if you're not getting along, have a conversation with somebody. If you still don't get it worked out, bring a couple more along. Have some prayer, and keep working at this. All absolutely true, but I also think about this sort of in this bigger scale, especially on this Sunday when we think about, our world, how much larger it is, and how some of these conflicts that we have are not necessarily just person to person, but sort of conflicts of ideas and groups and ways of seeing things. And how do we come together to overcome our social, our cultural, our group, our tribal differences? How do we live that love? And I think we are asked to break it down to that simple thing again, and is to have gatherings next to flat surfaces and share ourselves, share our hearts, share our stories. And it's hard sometimes. It's hard to put yourself, everything that we have kind of coming at us kind of works against us. Our social media feeds, our conversations with people who we're comfortable with, all those things sort of push us into sort of grouping ourselves into our tribes where we're with our folks, and over here stands those folks. And somehow we have to find ways to meet. In Romans, we see something that asks us to see this as an urgency. It's a summary of the commandments to love one another. It's like, how often do we miss the forest for the trees? Or how often are we only looking at the forest when we should maybe look a little closer at each individual tree? Because at the heart of this reading that Paul has said is he's summarizing Jesus' words when Jesus reminds us that most important commandment is to love God and then love one another. Love one another, and how easy it is to forget that. So that's why we celebrate communion. That's why we're celebrating communion every Sunday in this season of generosity, to be reminded, to remember that story of Jesus, that last meal around a flat, horizontal surface, where there was some food, where there was some bread, where there was some wine, and to ask us to participate in that again. To show us how, to exercise that muscle memory, and maybe do it in a space that's a little easier for us, maybe surrounded by our friends, so that we can remember how to do that and go out and do it someplace where it's just a little bit harder. Here we are all in one place, the wants and the wounds of the human race. Despair and hope sit face to face when we come in from the cold. Let us fill our cups with something kind, eggs and toast like bread and wine. We've heard it all before, but we don't mind.